Hey guys, Woods Farm here, just back at working on the Kubelwagen. Last I left, I was working on the hood, trying to figure out that problem. I talked about using this, using a wash basin or something I could buy and repurpose to build the hub. I don't like the idea of aluminum. You can't weld to it. I'd have to rivet it down. I wasn't keen on that, although this wash basin is just about perfect. I started thinking about wash basins and pans and whatnot, and I know of a place nearby, like an antiques kind of junkyard place, and I went there, and lo and behold, I was actually able to find some steel wash basins. Now, they had lots of really thin metal ones that were kind of porcelain covered or enameled. Not so good. I would have had to grind off that, and it would have been pretty thin material. But aside from anything that was cast iron, which they had tons of, they also had some old steel pots. I don't know how old this thing is. It's probably friggin' 150 years old or something, but it's steel. It's pretty thick too, maybe like 14 gauge, maybe even thicker. So it's good and solid. It doesn't taper, but after doing a bit of research, the later model Kubels had a more simplistic hub. The spokes that came out, the supports, were also simplified. Like everything, they kind of started to make it easier to build. So this will be, I think, is going to be a good enough facsimile, and it's going to be strong enough to hold the tire, and I'm going to be able to weld to it. So this is what I'm going with. So I'm just de-rusting it and getting it ready so I'll be able to paint it. This is the other thing I had to work on. No, I'm not trying to summon a demon, but I just needed to get a circle that was the right diameter to use as a pattern, so I could determine where the bolts needed to go. I think the hub has two or three bolts that are welded to it that protrude out, and that way when you put the tire over top, you can bolt it down in place. So this is just me trying to figure out where the center of the circle is, and obviously when you turn it over, that's a much nicer looking pattern. But this is going to give me a reference point and allow me to drill and attach bolts in a proper position. And there's the hood. You get the idea. So I've had to do some measuring and some figuring of where exactly the center is, where this hub assembly needs to go, and also the crisscross of spokes that come out from the center of the hood, and they kind of act, I assume they give the hood rigidity and strength, and they also they keep the tire from sitting directly on the hood. It's kind of lifted up. So I've got some scrap material. This is pretty thin walled square tube, 1.5 inches. I think I'm just going to use that to make these hubs that come out. Okay, so before I go ahead and actually weld down the hood, I'm going to do a rough wheel alignment. I think that might have been part of the problem I had when I was talking about clearance and the tires rubbing. So I read up a little bit about this online, and it's supposed to have a slight toe in, about 1/8. So just to get it kind of set to square, I'm just using a straight edge clamped on the back tire, and it's coming up along and giving me a guide to where the front tire needs to be aligned. It was actually out, and it took a lot more monkeying around than I thought, because I couldn't actually adjust these tie rods in any further past where they had rusted in place. So I had to take off the whole tie rod. The one tie rod end was seized in there. I did get it out with the torch, and then it still wouldn't close in far enough, and I actually thought maybe I might have to order a new tie rod or cut it off, but a little bit of WD-40 and some elbow grease, and they are actually able to go in, and I was able to get those threads loosened up. So now I can adjust it to where it needs to be. So now I'm just going over to the passenger side, and we're going to see where that ends up. Okay, so the wheel alignment's much better. I'm not going to say it's perfect, but drivable at the very least. I went ahead and changed the bushing. There's a rubber bushing in the steering column. That's probably the original one, but you can see it's pretty cracked. It's probably okay, but why not? It's not an expensive part, so I changed it out. And there was a safety wire, so I just replicated that with some wire. It goes from one bolt on one side to the other. That way, if something failed, I believe what this will prevent the steering column from actually separating apart. Kubelwagen. Last I left off, I had that problem with the brake fluid melting the paint around the pedal cluster. So originally, way back when, the pedal cluster that was on the thing was just completely trashed. So I got a used one from Thing Parts. Works fine, but the spring, the brake return spring, was a little sketchy. I ordered another one and realized you had to like pull the whole thing apart to change it, and obviously it was already mounted, and I'm like, and it was working fine. So I just left it. But lo and behold, the pedal's off, hopefully for the last time. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm waiting for the Kubel to dry and get ready for paint. I'm gonna try to figure this out. So the clutch pedal is on its own shaft, and it had a pin that I had to drive out. And I figured, yeah, it's still not going to come off, obviously, so I had to use heat. I heated it up, and then I quenched it with some water, and then I was able to drift it off. And that's the pedal right there. Still warm. And then there's a retaining, like a locking washer or clip. I'm sure there's a name for it. One of these guys. And now this will slide off, and I should be able to replace that spring. That's the part right there, brake pedal return spring. Seemed like a good as time as any to paint some of these structural framework here from the nose. Just getting a flat coat of rust paint, and probably give it 2 coats. It's not going to see a lot of weather once it's closed in, but some of this stuff like these cross pieces here, and you know, it's going to get some moisture and stuff on it and mud, so might as well give it a little bit of protection. That's drying nicely. Just a bit of rocker guard. It's not the same type of paint, the heavy duty rubberized rust paint I used, but it kind of blends in. So it's not bad. It'll do. Got the pedal back together, and I just gave it I cleaned it up with some brake clean. Got most of the grease and oil off of it, and I gave it another coat of paint. A lot of the paint on the bottom had gotten melted off, and in the process of taking it apart, some of the other paint chipped, so gave it another coat of matte black. We'll see how that holds up. Looks good for now. Just gonna work on these seats. This was the prototype seat bracket. Ended up being a little too short. Needs to raise up at least an inch, maybe an inch and a half. So I'm going to take some more measurements and rebuild this. Probably out of some thicker materials too. Okay, there's the bracket for the seat. I just have to finish welding it. It's just tacked together. If you can see that, there's slots here in the bottom of it. It's actually, so with the slots, I should be able to make it adjustable. I should be able to move it an inch forward or an inch back. Not that that's a big amount, but something. Like I said, the previous prototype was too short, so I added an 1.5 inches. And frankly, I feel like I probably could have went 2 inches. So I might make the next one 2 inches and swap it out for the driver's seat. But I'm just gonna finish welding this one up and paint it, and I'll decide from there. I'll mount it in the car and we'll see. I just sat it over in the car and it looks good. I sat in it, it's a lot better. That's it in the driver's position. It is quite a bit higher, and I just sat in it. It's way more comfortable. Your visibility is a lot better. So it's close, maybe a 1/2 inch higher. I mean, this particular seat could go higher. It's supposed to kind of just be below the bar here, so. But on the other hand, that's where it sits as per the rocker panel. I feel like the other Kubels I've seen, the seats maybe a bit lower. It's really hard to judge. So, but that's a nice comfortable position in terms of when you open the door, you can kind of just sit down right on the seat and then bring your legs in, or if you grab the steering wheel, put your feet in and then sit, and you can kind of scoot yourself in. It's not bad. Got to get that pedal cluster back in place once that paint dries up. Really not looking forward to it. The tricky part is getting the clutch cable hooked up, and it can certainly be a pain in the ass. Here's the stop for the clutch pedal, and I bought one and it was a little small, and so I made a custom one. I should have just done this in the first place. And what I actually did is I went ahead and added this little tab on the side, and that is where the brake return spring. It's sort of designed where it's supposed to just kind of like land on the floor, but I was having problems getting mine to actually stay in place, so I went ahead and made this little hole tab. It's got 3 holes. It's kind of adjustable. The previous spring was a bit shorter, so I think I had it in the second or the first hole. I actually drilled another hole today because that other spring is quite long. So hopefully this all goes back together. We'll see. So I actually got the driver's seat bolted down. I painted the bracket this morning and drilled the holes through the floor pans, and it's bolted down. I'm going to switch the orientation of the bolts and put some wing nuts on them, at least for the driver's side. Yeah, you can see how it's slotted, and the idea is the seat's actually adjustable forward and back. So I'll throw some wing nuts on there, and you'll actually be able to move it an inch forward or an inch back. Not much wiggle room, but it's something. The passenger seat's just going to be bolted down in place. And that's the passenger side seat bracket all welded up. I'm just going to paint it, get a coat of primer on it, and then just paint it. Got the pedal cluster all back together. I enjoy a lot of the design and the simplicity of the Volkswagen, but this thing is a pain in the ass. I mean, if you know a trick to make this easy, let me know. Basically, for starters, there's a little clip that keeps the clutch pedal from falling forward. And as you set it up, you have to pull out the clutch cable, hook it on a hook, and then bolt the pedal assembly in place without the pedal falling forward, because if it falls forward, the hook disengages and you have to start all over again. And then while you're trying to attempt that in the most cramped position, you have to get the brake pedal in place and get the push rod into the master cylinder, and there's this little return spring, the one that I changed out on the pedal cluster, that needs to get hooked on to a little protrusion on the pedal, all while everything kind of stays in place, and it's really frustrating. But after about 20 minutes of monkeying around with that, I managed to get it, probably just by sheer luck.